Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our first official episode of our podcast here in the collaborative parish of Ocean Pines and Snow Hill. Just to reintroduce ourselves, my name is Keagen Brown. I'm the pastor of Bates Memorial and Trinity United Methodist down in Newark and Snow Hill. And I'm joined by my co-host, Keagen Sadvari, who is the associate pastor at Community Church at Ocean Pines. And for those of you who missed our first episode, she is the one who's pretending to see what retirement looks like, but she hasn't successfully done that yet. That's okay, because we'll keep her as long as we can. So, Keagen, thank you for not retiring and going on this journey with me.
Thank you.
So this week, we're going to talk about chapter 1. And for those of you at home, we are not going to be reading the whole book of John out loud in 12 weeks because there's just not enough time. So what Keagen and I have done is we've gone through and in each chapter for each week, we've picked out some things to do as a Bible study, and we're going to just take you on our Bible study journey together. So, Keagen, I will go ahead and I'll just go ahead and kick us off by reading our first section. And for those of you at home, we're going to be reading from John 1:35 through the end, which is 51. And we're going to start with the first two verses, 35 to 37. So the next day, John, again, was standing with two of his disciples. And as they watched Jesus walk by, he exclaimed, "Look, here is the Lamb of God." Two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. So, Keagen, I have a question for you.
Okay.
You have a situation here where you have John the Baptist. And in Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, they say that Elijah has to return. And so we have this guy who we now know is Elijah, right, returning, and his disciples are leaving him to follow Jesus. So my question is, what do you think that John's humility in this moment teaches us about leadership and witness today?
I think it teaches us not to hold on too tight to that leadership, because there'll be times when people leave us to go to a different church because it speaks to them differently, feeds something in them that we're not feeding. I think, and it always calls us to recognize the leadership skills of other people and to make it about Jesus, not about us. That's the main thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's totally fair. I think that's actually one thing that I'm really excited about with the collaborative parish, because when you look at who we have between Pastor Dale and you and me, and then we've got the CLMs, like there's a lot of really, really powerful skills that are very, very varied. And that's a weird word choice there, very varied. But it's really interesting to see that. And then when you look at some of the things that we're blessed with in two of the three congregations, we have, well, actually all three congregations, we have retired pastors, not retired like you. We mean really retired pastors, right? Who are there as like a bench. And when you think about the way God's blessed the whole parish, it's amazing to think about that between, you've got in Community Church, you've got Conrad, you've got Dr. Bob, you've got Reverend Paul. Like we've got quite a few people, and they've all demonstrated that, where they've all, they've moved on and pointed to, hey, this is where you should be looking, which had to be hard for them. So I can only imagine. How do you think that John's example is something we have to live out? And when I say that, I mean specifically in that spirit of humility, like you talked about, like being willing to let people move on because they're at a different point in their spiritual journey. And so maybe they need somebody else. But how do you think that we internally should handle that? Because it's easy to say, it's harder to do.
Absolutely. And most of us draw our identity from our leadership to a certain extent.
I could see
And
that.
so when someone is moving on from that leadership, and in this example, it's not just that people have decided that John is not the leader appropriate for them. It's that John has decided there is something more important that they need to attend to, that they need to stop clinging to him and cling to Jesus, or at least explore a relationship with Jesus. And that's even harder than just seeing people leave. It's directing people, like, you're not being fed here. Go learn from this other person.
Well, and in this case, he's not just saying go learn from this person. He's using a specific term. He's saying, well, this is the Lamb of God.
Right. But most of us aren't going to face that.
No, thank goodness, right? Yeah. But I think that what we see here is not only does he say it, but you've got two of his disciples who recognize what that means. They picked up on it right away.
Yeah.
So he's harking all the way back to the Passover. Like, here's the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. Like, I'm the hors d'oeuvres. There's the buffet, right?
Right, right.
You know, and I think that even being able to openly say that shows he recognized his place in the grand scheme of
Absolutely.
things, which I think sometimes if you have a fruitful ministry, no matter what it is, I mean, it doesn't mean you're pastoring any kind of ministry or you can get puffed up and territorial, right?
Mhm.
John really shows that that's not the way we're supposed to be because no matter who we are, we're the hors d'oeuvres. We're not the buffet.
Right, right.
So, all right. Well, do you want to go on to 38 to 42?
Okay. When Jesus turned and saw them following, he asked, "What are you looking for?" They said, "Rabbi," which is translated teacher, "where are you staying?" He replied, "Come and see." So they went and saw where he was staying, and they remained with him that day. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. One of the two disciples who heard what John said and followed Jesus was Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which is translated to Christ. He led him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which is translated Peter.
There's a lot going on in that.
Yes, there is.
There's a ton to unpack there. We've got a brother who runs to get his brother. Then the brother immediately gets renamed. And
Hmm.
I can't think of a time in the Bible where someone was immediately renamed.
No, no, usually it's after something occurs. But I have to jump back a sentence or two. Because
Sure.
as a middle child, and I don't know why I always assume that Andrew is younger than Peter, but I always do. But I just think it's so wonderful that Andrew is the one who's there first and that Andrew is the one who goes to Simon. Because Andrew, in the grand scheme of things, is not one we consider one of the most important disciples, right? He doesn't get a whole lot of mention. And when he does, it's mostly as Peter's brother.
Yeah.
But here he is the one who brings Peter to meet Jesus.
Wow. So it's almost like his divine appointment was to bring Peter to Jesus.
Huh.
That's fascinating. I think that that's one of those times, like we were talking in our last episode, where like you just kind of like gloss over.
Right, right,
I've never thought about that, but you're right. Like if Andrew hadn't brought Peter, I mean, ultimately, if it was God's plan, Jesus and Peter would have been found
right.
together. But if that was Andrew's divine appointment, that's that's kind of interesting. Wow.
And it's kind of a role that works for all of us is that we are all meant to bring people to Jesus, even our families, because sometimes we don't always try to, help our families grow in their faith. We afraid to rock the boat, I guess, or cause
Yeah.
dissension.
Yeah. Well, and Andrew, he reminds us something in that sharing faith, it doesn't require eloquence. It was just an
Right,
invitation here. Like there was
right.
nothing big or special. But here he brings his brother to Christ literally by saying, hey, and he was excited. And it wasn't
Mhm.
eloquence that got him there. It was the excitement.
Right. And it doesn't tell us whether Peter was one of John's disciples or not. We don't know
Mm-mm.
that.
No. And I wonder, he couldn't have been because he had to go get him. Right? So he wasn't there with John for sure.
But it's not necessary that all of John's disciples were always with him all the time, is it?
No, it's true. That's true. Yeah. I guess in my mind, I see him almost having like a mosh pit that follows him, right?
Okay, okay.
Yeah, and you read later the stories of like the 5,000 that followed Jesus. Well, I mean, John must have had 100, that followed him everywhere. But we do know that Peter was married and he was a
Right,
fisherman, and he had to provide for his family.
right,
So, yeah, that's true. He could have been one of John's disciples that Andrew went and said, "Hey, time to switch shops."
right, right.
Yeah.
And I think
So
it's an odd little detail that they tell us it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
it's an odd detail. Well, it would have been right before sundown, which makes it in the Jewish calendar the end of the day because their days
Uh-huh.
start at sundown. So when they say that they remained with him that day, that means they stayed with him that whole day
Right. Right.
until that afternoon, at which point the day is over. So interesting, they leave out whether or not that next day was Sabbath or not. So we don't know that. We don't know
No,
which day it was.
no.
It's just
But
that
it
that would have
also
been,
indicates that they stay the night, which may be what you were saying, but I just wasn't sure.
yeah. Well, I think that's one thing that many people don't know about the Jewish calendar and faith is that, we think about it as like you wake up and you start your day,
Right.
where in their mind, the day starts when you go to bed, at sundown.
Mhm.
And so I do think it's impactful that it was at the end of the day because maybe what it's doing there is that they're saying that, well, he remained with him that day and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that's when he went, right? So the two that heard John speak and follow was Andrew, right? And then he went and got his brother. He may have had to rush to do that because if he's running towards the end of the day and if it was Sabbath, like he had to get that done.
Right.
So there was a certain amount of haste. And I wonder if that's why they're pointing out the time of day, if it infers what came next.
Maybe.
So let's talk about the renaming.
Okay.
So we've got Simon who Andrew brings Simon to Jesus, and Jesus looks at Simon and says, "Your name's not Simon, son of John. Your name is Cephas. It's Peter." Literally in that moment. What do you take from that?
Well, to me, it indicates that Jesus knew even before they had done anything, the role that Peter was going to play. In the other gospels, it's tied to Peter's confession that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Here, there is no confession. Now, Andrew had told Peter, "We found the Messiah," but Peter had not made a confession of that fact yet. It's just kind of floating around there. It's assumed that he accepted what Andrew said. And so I think it's interesting that it's at the beginning, not later. And it's
Yeah,
also interesting because it ties to the Old Testament people who were given new names. Jacob became Israel, Abram became Abraham. And so this ties the Old and the New Testaments together, much like we talked about yesterday.
the other thing I think it points to what you were saying is that he knew. I mean, it harkens back to David and when he says that knew me when I was being stitched together in my mother's womb. That like Jesus knew like this was what you were stitched together for. So it was his destiny, and I think we should all be grateful he was willing to accept it. That's where that free will comes into play.
Right. And it lets us know or reinforces the idea that the calling of the disciples wasn't random. Jesus didn't just even in the synoptic gospels, it sounds like he just walked by and saw them and he called them, but he knew who he was calling and he knew what role he had in mind for them.
Well, we also know what we know about Peter is he was the oldest disciple, and we know that because of when they had to pay the temple tax, because the tax was only needed for him and Jesus. So they were the only two over the age at which the tax was due. And I do think that a lot of times people think of the disciples as all being 30 years old. But the reality is many of them were really young because if the temple tax only had to be paid for Peter and Jesus, well, then many of them were young.
Okay.
They weren't little boys, right? They were probably 18, 20 years old. From what I've read, you didn't pay the temple tax till you were 21. So that means he was the only one over 21. And when you So which would support your statement about Andrew being the younger brother, right?
Okay.
Because we didn't have to pay the temple tax. So I think we did get you there. Um, you know, uh, and so if you think about it that way, it's like maybe Peter was needed for multiple reasons, because you don't hear about the other ones being married either.
No.
So,
Though
all
at
right, well,
one point, Peter said to Jesus, "We have left homes and families." Now that could be parents. I don't know.
true. Which is a call to all of us of what that means, though. I mean, I think about that often of that, to truly follow Christ, you have to be willing to leave homes and families. And when you think about these calls of these disciples, these 12 men truly gave up everything,
Uh-huh.
you know, and for all but one of them, up to their lives, they truly gave up everything for Christ. And I think that when they gave up their home, they meant literally, they didn't realize they were probably thinking of their earthly home, like the physical four walls and a roof, right? But it was really their whole home they were giving them because they never really had a place of rest from this day
Right.
forward.
Right.
All right. Well, you want me to take the the last section we got here, the 43 to 51. So the next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him about whom Moses and the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." And when Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him, he said of him, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." And Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" Jesus answered, "I saw you under the tree before Philip called you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly I tell you, you will see the heavens open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." I guess the first question that comes to mind there is we have our first skeptic. So many people talk about Thomas, right? But
Right.
it starts all the way at the beginning.
Yeah.
So, what's your thought on that skepticism that we have going on there from Nathaniel? I mean, he's a skeptic the whole way through, like questioning Nazareth, questioning everything.
Well, it's also a sign of prejudice, right? He has
That's
this
true.
impression of Nazareth and the people who come from there.
Yeah.
And maybe it's important to know that we're not perfect when Jesus calls us, and
Mm,
we will have attitudes from the outside culture or the way we grew up that give God a chance to transform us. But we don't have to have given them all up before we follow Jesus.
yeah. Yeah. It's like he meets us where we are.
Mhm.
Right. And the good news is he deals with us with maybe a stronger sense of honesty than we want
Right.
on,
Right.
like, well, why are you this way? And you have to be like,
But also with grace.
with grace. And if it wasn't for that, I think we'd all be, well, we know we'd all be, sunk if it wasn't for that grace. But luckily that exists.
I wanna go back to Philip
Sure.
because Philip is the only one where it says Jesus found Philip and said, "Follow me." No one else in this passage, in this version of the call of the disciples, is approached by Jesus and told to follow him. And again, Philip is not one we hear a lot about.
Mm-mm.
He pops up once in a while, but not often. And so I've always wondered, what was it that made Jesus go and find Philip?
Well, I would have to wonder if it's, you have Philip and he does the same thing Andrew does. And God is looking for people with different spiritual gifts. And evangelism is a gift. And it's not a gift
Absolutely.
that's given to everybody. And one thing we know about the disciples is that they all had different gifts and traits. Many people look at Matthew and then you question, well, why would he choose a tax collector? Right? He was good with money, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So, and you needed that, so why did you need a zealot? Right. Well, because you needed someone who had some fervor, that would really get behind the cause when the going got rough and could keep everybody else motivated. And so maybe the point to Andrew and Philip was to, be those evangelists to say, hey, this is it, guys. It's finally happening. Because if you don't have those people who stand on the street corners with the sandwich boards on, and the megaphones, like, you got to have somebody bring you to the ministry.
Right, right.
So, what's your thought on the fact that right here is the first time we hear the Son of Man title?
That's interesting. It brings up the fully human, fully divine. And it's interesting that it's usually Jesus who uses that title. You don't hear other people talking,
Right.
referring to Jesus that way. It's a way Jesus refers to himself. And I guess it ties back to the fact that God dwells with us, like from Exodus, when God dwelt with the people and traveled with the people through the wilderness.
Yeah.
And now, because for the Gospel of John, the incarnation is the main thing. I mean, the crucifixion is important, the resurrection is important, but the incarnation is John's main point, that God literally came down to earth and took on human form and lived with us. And so I think it reflects that emphasis.
What's you're absolutely right. And I think what's impactful about that is that when you read about the angels, right? They say that the angels are look on what God does for us in awe, right? Like we are so in theory in the greater scheme of the universe insignificant. And yet the God of all creation came down for us. And to your absolute point, John really focuses on that and he's trying to really drive home how important that is. And I think that that's why he starts with the in the beginning was the word was God, and the word was with God, right? Because you got to start there. Like, I mean, this plan that John's laying out of what, God and Jesus came to do was laid out all the way back in the very, very beginning. And when you think about God says to Satan right there in the garden, the seed of the woman is going to, crush your head. You'll bite his heel, but he's going to crush your head. Like this has been planned for centuries and it's now happening. And John's I think, trying to call that out and say, this is the time, here we are, get out your scrolls because every prophecy that you see, they're getting ready to come true. You know, you know, life is real now. Life is real.
And one thing I've read in these past couple weeks is it links all this to Psalm 8, where it's that beautiful, how majestic is your name in all the earth, and we are just insignificant, yet you make us just a little lower than the angels. And the continues to that is that we are allowed to associate with the Son of God, that we are allowed to be here, that God entrusted his son to us.
Yeah. That's a really good way of wording it, that he entrusted him to us because he entrusted us to us knowing what we were going to do for him. Right.
Uh-huh.
So, and that he loves us enough that that was the goal. The goal was that reconciliation that was only going to come one way. And that is a really good word choice. That and trusting. I like that a lot. So, I want to tuck into the very end when he's talking to Nathaniel and he talks about like, well, why do you believe me? Because I saw you under the fig tree. And he goes on and he says, and let me just read it. You'll see greater things than these. And he said to him, very truly, I say to you, you'll see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the sons of man. I wanted to tuck into that because I think a lot of people don't understand just the sheer importance of that statement. Because I think it's one of those things. The very next verse is the wedding at Cana and the first miracle. And everybody's like, yeah, let's get into it. And yet this piece ties the bow on everything we've been talking about today about how God came down because it's really playing back to Jacob. And so we talked a little bit earlier about all of the investment that God made in Jacob. And Jacob's dreaming. He's got his head on a rock. Sounds horrible, by the way. And in his dream, he sees the ladder. And so as kids, we hear about Jacob's ladder and you see the picture of it like being a ladder and angels are coming up and down the ladder, but that's not really what it looked like. Right? They talk about how it was really more of a stairs that went from heaven down. And like Jacob names it Bethel because he says, surely the Lord is in this place.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I think that we don't realize in this space is I think the reason that Jesus says this to Nathaniel is what he's trying to say to him is like, Nathaniel knew the Bible. He knew the Old Testament because of some of the things that he was saying to Jesus, like you truly are the Son of God, the King of Israel. Like in the moment that he made the comment about the fig tree, he recognized who this was. And he's saying, you don't really recognize who I am. Let me tell you who I am. That when Jacob saw Lord at the top of the ladder, that was me. And I'm the person who's coming down. And I think of this as actually the hidden, it's kind of like in Disney where they talk about the hidden Mickeys, right? And you have these things, right? But I think this is a hidden I am, right? He doesn't say I am yet. We haven't gotten to the I am statements, but he's saying I am the pathway to heaven. Like I am the way the angels are coming up and down, and I am the way you're going to do that too. And I think that that's where it was really impactful that he said this because Jacob got to see this in a dream, but Nathaniel, you're going to see this in real life,
Uh-huh.
right?
Uh-huh.
And so much happens after this. You have the wedding at Cana. He's cleansing the temple. You get Nicodemus, like all this really cool stuff that we tuck into happens next. But this piece is so important because in the beginning was the Word, right? And like you and I were talking about, like, this is the connection. And he's saying this to Nathaniel now. Like, you can say all the head knowledge you have, but that head knowledge is going to turn into something so much more because you're going to see what was a vision in real life.
Uh-huh.
And one day we're going to get to see that too. And I can't wait for it. I can't wait for it. I'll be honest, I don't want it to come too soon, right? But but I can't wait for it. So if you had to look at this whole chapter, the calling of the disciples, and we talked in our last episode about how much the call of disciples means to you, right? If you were to wrap this up in a bow and say that this is why this speaks to me the most, what would you say?
I think it shows that Jesus wants a conversation,
I love that. I love that.
that it's not like my way or the highway. It's what do you think? Why do you believe? I mean, it starts off with what are you looking for? And I've heard a long time ago that faith is in the questions, not in the answers.
Yeah.
And Jesus often answers questions with questions. And so I think from this very beginning, it's a conversation, it's not a hierarchy.
I want to build on what you just said and share something that I learned recently. And it was a moment for me, one of those aha moments. And it was that Jesus never really asks a question. He's omniscient. So whenever he's asking a question, it's to make us think.
Mhm.
And a really wise woman named Karen Sadvari said that in one of her sermons, right? And it really was. It's so amazing when you said that. I remember that. It was a couple of months ago when you said that, and you're like, he doesn't need to ask a question. He knows it all already. It's there to make you think. And I think that that's what he was doing to Nathaniel. And I think that's what he's doing to us today. So I totally appreciate that takeaway from you. All right. Well, thank you for going through John 1 with me. And next week, I think we're doing John 2 and 3. So for those of you home, we're not doing all of John 2 and 3. We're going to pick a little bit out of both and go through those. But we will see you next time on our next episode. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.